Any questions over the homework?
No, but I need to turn it. Pretty good. What's Jeff do it? Okay. How is it going to be 8? Yeah, how do you set it to the book? Pretty Jeff.
All right, guys. Any questions on the homework? Completing the square. We started this on Friday, but we're going to continue on, finish this up today. We had 4 main steps. Is A equal to 1? If not, make it so. So if it is not equal to 1, if the number in front of x squared is not 1, we need to get it to be 1. The second step is to get the constant terms by themselves. Selves and leave 2 spaces. Really, we're just wanting the variables on one side, our constant terms on the other. Bless you. Step number 3 is to find C, which is equal to b over 2 squared. And once we find it, then plug in. And our last step is to factor and solve. Last step is to factor and solve. Guys, we're either going to pay attention or we're going to move. Questions on these steps here? All right, now we're going to use these steps to solve quadratics. And the nice thing about these steps here is no matter what the original setup, no matter what we start out with, we can solve any quadratic equation using these steps. Now we already solved this one here on Friday, x squared minus 16x plus 64 equals 100. And we can still use these steps to solve this here, even though, especially if we didn't notice the fact that this here is already a perfect square trinomial, we can still go about using these steps to solve. Now the first step is a equal to 1. Is the number in front of x squared 1? Yes. So that means our next step is to get the constant terms by themselves and the variables on one side. So really variables on one side, so x squared and x on one side, all of our numbers without x on the other. So for this here, we would subtract 64 from both sides and then leave 2 spaces. So we'd have x squared minus 16x plus blank is equal to 36 plus blank. Because our 64 minus 64 is 0. Our 100 minus 64 is 36. Questions on steps 1 or 2? All right. Step number 3 is to find the value of c to make this a perfect square trinomial so that we can solve. Well, c is equal to b over 2 squared. And our value of b is the number and sign in front of our x term. Well, our x term in this case is what? It is 16, but it would be what? Negative 16, because we take the number and the sign. So the number and sign in front of x. So the number is 16, but we do take its sign, which is negative, and we get negative 16. Questions on this so far? Now at this point here, we need to divide. Negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. And negative 8 squared is 64. So we can plug that into both sides to get our perfect square trinomial, which is really telling us that the x squared minus 16x plus 64 was a perfect square trinomial to begin with. Questions on this here before we factor and solve? Now to factor x squared minus 16x plus 64, so we have our set of parentheses x and our square. Now the number and sign that goes inside the parentheses is this number and sign of what we have inside the parentheses solving for c before we square it. So since it was negative 8 inside the parentheses being squared, our factored form is x minus 8 squared. One thing we have left to do before solving is simplifying the other side. 36 plus 64 is 100. Any questions on anything we've done so far before we start solving? First step in our solving process is going to be take square root of both sides, because our square root and square would cancel, telling us that x minus 8 is equal to plus or minus. So we need to find the square root of 100, and the square root of 100 is 10. Almost. And we get this here. Now at this point here, we do need to solve. And to solve, the first thing we're going to do is add 8 to both sides. Because our negative 8 plus 8 will cancel out, leaving us with x by itself is equal to 8 plus or minus 10. Can we add 8 and 10 together? Are they like terms? Yes. If the two numbers are like terms, we need to add and subtract. Because what it's telling us is that we have two separate statements. We do have that x is equal to 8 plus 10. Well, 8 plus 10 is 18. And 8 minus 10 is negative 2. So our two solutions here are 18 and negative 2. Questions on this here? Questions on any of this here so far? Are you ready for the next one? All right. I'm going to skip the next one and go to this one here, because the next one is already a perfect square trinomial. I think it'd be better for us to go on and look at one that's not a perfect square trinomial to start with and go from there. And again, when we look at this here, one of the things I will say is not a certain step, but it's getting the like terms together. If we have x's on both sides, constant terms on both sides, x squares on both sides, it's going to be better to get it equal to 0 or get those like terms on the same side of the equal sign and together. Now our first real step is a equal to 1. Is the number in front of x squared 1? If not, make it so. Well, here, the x squared term is indeed 1. So we can move on to the second step. Now our second step is to get the constant terms by themselves. So here, variables x squared and 4x, negative 4x are already on the same side. We just need to get the constant term on the other side. And we can do that by subtracting 8 from both sides. So we do have our x squared negative 4x. We're going to leave a space to plug in c. And we're going to leave a space on the other side because our 0 minus 8 is negative 8. So it tells us that x squared minus 4x plus blank equals negative 8 plus blank. Questions on this so far? Next thing we need to do is find the value of c so that we can make our perfect square trinomial. Now c is equal to b over 2 squared. Well, our value of b in this case is what? Negative 4. Now at this point here we could put parentheses negative 4 over 2 close parentheses squared and let it do it for us. But it is helpful to do the division of 2 first before we plug it in. Because negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. So finding the 4 does tell us what we need to add to both sides, what we need to use to complete this square. Now when we're factoring, we do have our set of parentheses and x. The negative 2 inside the parentheses tells us what our factor is going to be. It's going to become x minus 2 squared is equal to, well, negative 8 plus 4 is negative 4. Questions on how we got to this point here? Questions on any of this so far? I'd say for the most part, I mean, this is the square root method. We've done this before. It's just we're adding the process of making the perfect square trinomial. Our next step would be to square root both sides. Because on the left-hand side, our square root and square would cancel, telling us that x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus. Now this time again, we're taking the square root of negative 4. Now the negative is going to come out as I. Negative is going to come out as I. And the reason we do this is so that we can take what's left, square root of 4, and plug it into the 30xs. The yellow calculator will simplify radicals if they don't simplify. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, which is just telling us the square root of negative 4 is 2i. Questions on this here? Questions on anything we've done so far? So we good with all this here? Okay. Next thing we need to do is add 2 to both sides. Because our negative 2 plus 2 will cancel, telling us x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2i. Now the big question, are 2 and 2i like terms? No. That's it. X is equal to 2 plus or minus 2i. We really do have two statements there. We have 2 plus 2i and 2 minus 2i. We don't have to split them up. You don't have to write them as two separate cases. We just write the one. Questions on this here? Questions on everything we've done so far? I'm good with this so far. X squared plus 8x minus 5 equals 0. So again, the first thing we'd be looking for is making sure we got most of our terms on the same side. X squareds are on the one side, x's are on the same side. It's going to make it easier if a is different from 1. But here, is the value of a equal to 1? Yeah, the number in front of that x squared is 1. And the reason we know it is the x squared term is because we're referring back to the general form, our ax squared plus bx plus c. This here. A, our number in front of x squared, is indeed 1. And if there was, say, x squareds on both sides, we would need to get them onto the same side before we check that. But it is indeed 1. So that means we can move on to step 2, get the constant term on one side, the numbers on one side, variables on the other. And we can do that by adding 5 to both sides. And it'll tell us that x squared plus 8x plus our blank is equal to 5 plus blank. So we got the constant term on one side, and we left 2 spaces. Questions on any of this here? That means we can move on to our third step. We need to find the value of c, which is our b over 2 squared. Now looking at this problem here, what's the value of b? 8. So the first thing we can do is 8 divided by 2, which is 4, and 4 squared is 16. So we're going to add 16 to both sides. Questions on any of this here? Questions on anything we've done so far? Okay. Now we move on to step number 4. We're going to factor and then solve. So we're going to factor our x squared plus 8x plus 16. Well, we'll have our set of parentheses in x. And the number that goes inside the parentheses is the number that we have inside the parentheses to find c before we square it, which is 4, but it would be what? Positive 4. Yes. Which tells us we have x plus 4 squared. On the other side, we have 5 plus 16, which is 21. Questions on this here? Questions on anything we've done so far? Now the last thing we have to do for this is to solve. And to solve, we're going to square root both sides. Yep. And we take square to both sides, well, the square root and square will cancel, telling me that x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus. We have to add the plus or minus whenever we take the square root of both sides. Now we need to find the square root of 21. Well, the 30xs will take any of our square roots and simplify them if possible. Well, the square root of 21 is square root of 21. Because if it was, say, the square root of 24, well, that simplifies to 2 square root of 6. If we can reduce it, we need to reduce it. And last but not least, we need to solve for the value of x, and we can do that by subtracting 4 from both sides, telling us x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 21. Questions on this here? We ready for the next one? All right. I don't know why I keep scrolling down. So we have this one here. We want to solve it by completing the square. So a is equal to 1, yes? No, because this time this is the first one where we have a value in front of x squared that is different than 1. Now we can make sure that, again, it is equal to 0. There is no other x squared terms. So since it is equal to 3, we need to make the term in front of x squared be 1. And we can do that by dividing the x squared term by 3. Unfortunately, we can't just divide the x squared term by 3. We have to divide every term by 3. So our 3x squared divided by 3 is x squared. Our 12x divided by 3 is going to be plus 4x. Our plus 15, 15 divided by 3 is 5. And 0 divided by 3 is 0. So we have to simplify that a value. We need it to be 1 for us to be able to use completing the square on this here. Since the a value is now 1, we need to get the variables on one side and the constant terms on the other. And to do that, we're going to subtract both 5 from both sides. And then we're going to leave 2 spaces. So it's going to tell us that x squared plus 4x plus blank equals negative 5 plus blank. Questions on this here? Now our next step is to find the value of c. Well, c is equal to b over 2 squared. Now our number and sign in front of our x is positive 4. So our value of b in this case is positive 4. Now our 4 divided by 2 is 2. And our 2 squared is 4. So we can add it to both sides to give us this perfect square trinomial. Telling us that the x squared plus 4x plus 4 is our perfect square trinomial. And it's equal to negative 5 plus 4. Now at this point here, we need to factor the x squared plus 4x plus 4. So we'll have x, the number and sign that goes inside the parentheses, is going to be 2. And since that 2 was positive, it's going to be plus 2. On the other side, negative 5 plus 4 is negative 1, telling us that x plus 2 squared is equal to negative 1. Now at this point here, we're going to take square root of both sides. Well, here our square root and square will cancel, telling us that x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus. At this point here, we need to take the square root of negative 1. Well, what is the square root of negative 1? The negative would indeed turn into I, leaving us with the square root of 1, which is, so 1i, or I, because I by definition is what? I is the square root of negative 1. So really, we could just replace the square root of negative 1 with I. And last but not least, we still need to solve for x. Still need to solve for the value of x. Let's focus up here. We can subtract 2 from both sides, telling us x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus I. Now, since I and negative 2 are not like terms, We can't combine them. And this here is our final answer. Questions on anything we've done so far? All right. We ready for the next one? Negative 3x squared minus 18x minus 6 equals 0. All the terms are on the same side and combined. Is a equal to 1? No. So what do we need to do to make it be 1? We need to divide by negative 3. Because dividing by 3 would make the number in front of x squared, our a number, be 1. It just wouldn't make it be positive 1. It would make it be negative 1. We need it to be positive 1. So we divide by negative 3, because negative 3x squared divided by negative 3 is x squared. Our negative 18x divided by negative 3, the negative divided by negative is a positive. 18 divided by 3 is 6. Negative 6 divided by negative 3 is going to be positive 2. So we have x squared plus 6x plus 2 is equal to 0. So the first thing we had to do was divide by negative 3 to get a to be 1. Our second step is to get the constant terms on one side, our numbers without a variable on one side, our numbers with a variable on the other. Well, the only thing we have to do for that there is to subtract 2 from both sides. And then we'll leave 2 spaces. Telling us that we have x squared plus 6x plus blank equals negative 2 plus blank. C is equal to b over 2 squared, and our b value is indeed positive 6. Now 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. Questions on how we found C? Now at this point here, we need to factor. Our x squared plus 6x plus 9, well, we'll have x, and the number and sign that goes inside there is the number and sign of what we had inside our parentheses to find C before we squared it, which would give us x plus 3 squared. On the other side, negative 2 plus 9 is 7. Our next step to solve is going to be take square root of both sides, because here our square root and square will cancel, telling us that x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. Because the square root of 7 will not reduce, it will not simplify, so we'll have to leave it as the square root of 7. And lastly, we're going to subtract 3 from both sides, telling us x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. Now, negative 3 and the square root of 7 are not like terms. We can't add or subtract them, mainly because the 7 has a radical, the 3 does not. They aren't the same radical, so this is as far as it goes. This is as far as we can take it here. Questions on any of this here? Questions on anything we've done so far? Questions on this lesson here? All right, well, I think we feel pretty comfortable with these here. We're going to skip that one, and I want to look at this one. This one's not technically in your notes, so you can go and scratch the last one out and put this one in its place. Now, this is a little different than the ones we had. I wouldn't say too much different, but it is one that's good to see and one that's good to look at. So looking at this here, variables, everything's on one side of the equation. Is A equal to 1? No. If not, make it so. So here we have to divide everything by 2. Well, 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared minus 5 divided by 2. Well, 5 does not divide by 2 nicely, so we're going to leave it as 5 halves x. 67 divided by 2. Well, 67 does not divide by 2 nicely either. So we'll leave it at 67 halves. And the last one we have is 0 divided by 2 is what? 0. So whenever we get something that does not divide nicely, we're going to leave it as a fraction. Because it's going to be easier to solve these in fractional form than it is to try to solve these as in decimal form. Questions on this here so far? Now at this point here, we need to get the constant term on one side and the variables on the other. Luckily for us, the only thing we have to do is subtract 67 halves from both sides, telling us that x squared minus 5 halves x plus blank is equal to negative 67 halves plus blank. Questions on this so far? C is equal to b over 2 squared. Now what's the value of b this time? Well, it's negative what? Negative 5 over 2. Well, luckily for us, we don't have to do this by hand, because both calculators will do negative 5 over, well, we need the 5, over 2, which is negative 5 over 4. And lastly, we need to square it. And negative 5/4 squared is 25/16. Now, if we were trying to factor x squared minus 5 halves x plus 25/16, we would do something to try to get rid of those fractions. But luckily for us here, factoring this is not that bad, because the number and sign that go inside the parentheses with x is the number and sign of what we have before we square it to find c, which is telling me that this is going to be negative 5, not halves, but fourths. So x minus 5/4 squared is our factored form. Now the other thing we need to find, it simplifies negative 67 halves plus 25/16. And luckily, the calculator can do that for us, telling us negative 511 over 16. Questions on how we got to this point here? Well, now we can start solving, and again, our first step in solving is to square root both sides. And well, here our square root and square would cancel. telling us x minus 5/4 is equal to plus or minus. We need to simplify this radical. Well, this negative is going to come out as what? I. And luckily enough, if it has a fraction, if it's in a fraction before we take the square root, it's going to stay a fraction. It's not miraculously going to go away. Because if it could go away, it would have gone away at this point already. Now, what we really have left, and especially what we're going to type in the calculator, is the square root of 511 over the square root of 16. Oh, wait a minute, what's the square root of 16? What times itself is 16? 4. Even if we don't see that, we can still type it all in, and it'll tell us that it's square root of 511 over 4. Questions on how we got to this point here, or how we simplified that fraction? Are you ready for the next step? We can add 5/4 to both sides, because negative 5/4 plus 5/4 is 0. Minus x is equal to 5/4 plus or minus the square root of 511 over 4. Now, I don't know about you. I wouldn't say that this is a major increase in difficulty from what we did. A lot of it the calculator did for us. But it's not as nice as some of the previous ones, especially when that greatest common factor does not divide out of every term nicely. Questions on this here? We ready for the next one? That's it. This is your assignment. You have 8 problems. 7 of them you're solving by completing the square. And problem number 38 is one of our error detection. So you have to find the error in the problem. And I'll tell you this here, the error is going to come in for how they use the formula. So I'd be checking the formula on that there. But that's it.